So hopefully everybody can see my slides. So I'm quite excited to be here today and to talk about something that I find personally quite important. As Michael mentioned, I've been doing evaluations for quite a number of years here at the University of Alberta in different contexts. I'm currently with the Community University Partnership, working with the Evaluation Capacity Network, looking at how we can increase evaluation capacity both within the university and also outside the university, amongst different groups and individuals. So today's presentation will be, as the name suggests, a short guide to evaluative thinking, and I want to, as I begin here, just take a moment to thank Bethan for setting up this presentation. Really, the slides and the content in the slides are in large part from her. So she did a lot of work on the background to set this up. So an outline of what I want to talk about today in terms of evaluation thinking, basically just a description of what it is, why you might want to do it, how you can do it, and then questions, if there are questions that people have. The primary resources from which the content is drawn are these two resources. Everyday Evaluation on the Run, which is a very useful book. I think it's located in libraries, and obviously you can get it off, you can purchase it from bookstores. The one on the right, the Evaluative Thinking Identifying Assumptions, is also a useful guide. That one, I believe, is available free online. So if you're looking for some resources, here's a couple of really good ones. And as I said, a lot of the content from today will be drawn from both of these particular resources. So I guess just to start, one of the things working in evaluation that I confront all the time are negative perceptions with respect to evaluation. Usually when somebody mentions that the evaluators here, you either get an audible groan or at least you see the pained expressions on people's faces when it comes to evaluation. I understand. I think that part of that negative, or part of the negative connotation associated with evaluation, in large part stem from people's negative experiences, but also I think is related to, in some aspects, maybe misconceptions about what evaluation actually is or what evaluation could be. And so to start off with, I think that it's important to point out the fact that we're all evaluators, and we're doing evaluation constantly. I mean, just take the example of getting out of the bed in the morning, right? There's a number of evaluative types of experiences that we're going through, as we're getting ready to go to our workday, like, whether to hit the snooze button, judgments looking out the window as to what to wear based on the weather, a brief review of, the day's events, what do I have to do, what's on, and on and on. Noticing, the clothing that I left on the floor, assessment of what I'm going to do tonight, judging my best route to my morning meeting, and on and on and on. And this is something that I think we're constantly going through, whether or not we're aware that we're making these types of evaluations on an ongoing basis. So we're all evaluators and we're all engaging in some forms of evaluation. So this gets to the question of, so what is evaluative thinking and why should we care about evaluative thinking? And I think for me, when I think about evaluative thinking, really what it comes down to is more of a mindset than anything. And it's a mindset where we express a willingness to ask, basically, how do we know what we think we know? And I think this is the real difference. And this is the thing that again, in terms of the evaluations I've done and the people I've talked with respect to evaluation, is the place I think where sometimes I have the hardest struggles in trying to convince people that evaluation is in fact useful. And I think one of the things that happens often just in our society in general is we sometimes don't explicitly consider why we think we know what we know and upon what evidence we're basing our decisions. And just to take you through a couple examples of, common ways in which people decide that they know something or think about this, and think about this in your own context. So some of the ways that we do this, one is we appeal to authority figures. So a doctor, a teacher, another professional tells us, what the truth is, or what's important for us to know, which I think can be important in some context, because obviously we don't have all the time in the world to go and do all the background. If it's doctor, for example, I could go to the medical library and I could look up all of the studies on different types of treatments for particular problems, or I can just trust that my doctor knows what he's doing and take the pills that he prescribes. So sometimes it makes some sense to appeal to authority figures, but really, when we're doing that, we're not actually thinking about all the time, you know, is this a valid approach? Is this something that I should believe? Another example would be common sense, which I think we hear a lot about. Well, it's just common sense. The problem with that is that common sense isn't always common sense, and sometimes we're susceptible to our own biases. We're susceptible to our beliefs and our desires for what we want to be true. And so what can sometimes happen is that we seek out information that would confirm our pre-existing beliefs. Not only that, we pay more attention to that information, and we tend to disregard stuff or information that contradicts our preconceived biases and beliefs. So our own common sense sometimes can lead us down a path perhaps where we don't want to go. And on and on and on. And we see, for example, in lots of times in political discourse and in advertisement, something referred to as tenacity, which is simply just stating or repeatedly stating or making statements over and over and over and over again. And through sheer repetition, sometimes those statements can start to take on a sense of veracity or truthfulness, not because they're actually true, but simply because we've heard it so often that it starts to sound kind of like the common sense. So part of with evaluative thinking, and again, this is what I think is, for me, probably the most important aspect of this, is that willingness to really just consider, how do I actually know what I know? What's the evidence that I'm using to base those decisions upon? And so we can start to get into situations where hopefully, if we can institute a culture of evaluative thinking, that we can maybe just push the pause button every once in a while and start to consider some of those questions about, what is the evidence? What is actually leading to the outcome that I am seeking, that I'm looking at, and so forth. And so when we look at then evaluative thinking, really it is critical thinking applied in the context of evaluation. And when we talk about this as a mindset, it's really motivated, by an attitude of inquisitiveness, curiosity, wanting to know, wanting to figure out, wanting to try to decide, or make decisions that are based upon the best data possible. So some of the key elements in that then would be to identify the assumptions that we are coming into a problem with. And sometimes this can be tough, and sometimes I think that one of the most important aspects of doing an evaluation is to lay that all out on the table. And then once we do that, we can start to pose some thoughtful questions. I sometimes come into situations where I've been asked to do an evaluation where somebody says, we really need to do a survey, or we really need to do a bunch of interviews. So a lot of times what I start off with is, well, you know what, maybe we should just hold on and try to figure out what the question is first. And once we know what the question is, then we can figure out the best way to ask that question. Sometimes it's a survey, sometimes it's not a survey, sometimes it's simply having a conversation. So if we pose thoughtful questions, hopefully that will start to guide our decisions about how we're going to actually collect that data, that evidence that we're going to use to make those decisions. Then we pursue deeper understanding through reflective practice and perspective taking. If the more we can sort of, again, as I said, push the pause button a little bit and reflect on why we think we know what we know, and upon kind of what we're basing our decisions, I think that we're in a better position to start making those evidence-based decisions. Now, this doesn't mean that, for example, conventional evaluations are of no use. Obviously, I'm someone who does evaluations all the time, and I think there is obviously great benefit in doing evaluations when those evaluations are called for. And I think sometimes what can stand in the way of doing sort of more conventional evaluations, obviously, they're expensive. They cost often a lot of money. Sometimes in organizations, we don't always have the expertise on hand or available. We may not have the time to do this. Sometimes, for example, decisions need to be made now or right away, and we don't have the time to go through a complex evaluation. And to be frank, sometimes a formal evaluation or a conventional evaluation is just not necessary for the types of context or groups or decisions that we happen to be making at that particular time. And so if the decision is, or if the context is such that, you know, a conventional evaluation is important and we have the funds for it, then by all means, let's do that. If not, however, let's not keep those things from using evaluative thinking and, again, going through that critical reflective kind of process to make good decisions. Now, why do I think this is absolutely critical, especially at this point in the history of the world? One of the great and also troubling things that we experience right now, I think, is the sheer volume of information we have available at our fingertips. There's so much information that we are being bombarded with, that we have access to. Part of the challenge becomes, how do we filter through all of that information to pull out the relevant, critical, useful bits from that avalanche of information that we're exposed to? More than ever, I think, in our history, the responsibility is more and more on the consumer of information to be able to make those decisions for themselves. In past eras, we at least, you know, information that was presented to the public had to make it through some editorial process. This is no longer the case. Anybody with a computer and an internet connection can publish whatever they want with little to no oversight at all. And all of that can appear as truth, as valid, as important information. So it's really up to us or the consumer to be able to figure out, you know, how to unpack all that. And second, as service providers and nonprofits, sometimes, I mean, we're the closest to the consumers of services we provide. And as such, the responsibility is on us to make sure that those services are meeting the needs of the groups that we're working with, and for advocating for them as necessary. And so part of this, and if you look at the diagram, really this is kind of pushing that pyramid back up, right? And trying to figure out how we best can support those who we are responsible for. So one of the key elements with this evaluative thinking then, so in addition to the critical lens and the reflective practice, is understanding and deciding who our critical reference group is. Ultimately, the focus of evaluation really should be on that group who we are trying to serve. In any evaluation, and I find this this dilemma a lot of times in the evaluations I do, there's competing demands with respect to whose needs I'm trying to meet with the evaluation. Funders obviously have requirements that they need. So there's sometimes pressure to gather information to meet the needs of those funders, bureaucrats and programs, other people, professional organizations, and on and on and on and on. So if, however, the evaluation is focused on a particular group of individuals, at the end of the day, the information we collect and the focus of our evaluation should be on that particular group. And so the type of information we collect and the methods we use should match that critical reference group and should allow us to gather information that provides information directed towards that group and really allows learning to be the focus. So when we figure out what that critical reference group is, or who that critical reference group is, we kind of have to balance accountability with learning and improvement. And really the primary user for evaluative thinking would be you and your team. And so the focus for evaluative thinking, in contrast to sort of more conventional evaluation processes perhaps, is on internal learning and improvement. And hopefully what should happen then, this should make you more accountable. But at the end of the day, if we're doing this right, that it is kind of a false dichotomy, and that by improving our learning and focusing on our clientele that we're serving, we should be able to also at the same time, prove or at least to provide information for accountability as well. So in some ways, it is kind of a false dichotomy, and by doing one, we're actually doing the other as well. The other thing that happens when we look at or we engage in evaluative thinking is sometimes we can kind of step outside the messiness. And if we look at all of the complex types of information and challenges and different types of things that are going on around us, really what it sometimes comes down to is just trying to improve what we do through reflective practice on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment type of basis. We often work in complex environments that are constantly changing, and so we need feedback. And sometimes that feedback, like I said, if we do a conventional evaluation, an evaluation that takes me a year to get the data is not going to help me tomorrow when I have to go meet with a particular client group, or I have to figure out how I'm going to do something better on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day type of basis. So waiting until the end of something to evaluate it, again, often sometimes can be ineffective, because by the time the project's over, we may have missed the opportunity to improve. And as a result of that, sometimes then we miss the opportunity to affect those who most need this to work. So in terms of sort of conventional evaluation, a developmental evaluation, for example, might be an approach that we could use in those type of environments. But as I said, sometimes those simply aren't possible due to time or funds or expertise or what have you. So again, in our everyday practice, we can start to implement some types of evaluative thinking that hopefully will allow us to make those better decisions on the moment-to-moment, day-to-day, week-to-week kind of basis. So some of the things that we might ask ourselves then as we're going through this, right? And these are these kind of short-term evaluative thinking kinds of processes where we can ask ourselves things like, is what I'm doing valuable? To whom? Is it worthwhile or not? And again, to whom? Is it good, bad, right, wrong? Is it going off the rails? Are we doing what we think we're doing in different types of situations? We evaluate, again, we do this all the time. And the key thing here, and I think the key difference between, or that makes it evaluative thinking, is the mindful approach that we're actually doing this on purpose, where we actually take time, whether it's in a staff meeting or whether it's just reflective time after we've engaged in a process, where we think about, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what the impact has been. And so sometimes, even as we go through the process, we may gather information that we don't fully, recognize the importance of it right now, but perhaps as we document that, as we take the time to think about it, that later on, some of those things will start to click. And so sometimes it's even just the timing of the question that's important. And the more we do this over time, the better and more full picture we can get as to, again, the worth of the program or the intervention or whatever it is we're doing, and who and how we're benefiting, and in different ways which we can improve our own practice and make things in the future perhaps work better. I see this in my day-to-day work at the university when I teach classes. One of the things that I try to do after every single class is just take a few minutes to think about, how did that go? Did I achieve the goals that I had? What went wrong? What could I do better in the future? And sometimes it's through those little kind of evaluative moments that I can make small adjustments to things that I'm doing. And so often what I'll do is if something didn't go the way I want it to do, the next time I go teach the class, I'll try something different. And then I'll kind of go back and again, as I take those few minutes to kind of conceptualize, what were my goals and did I meet those goals or not, I can make those small adjustments. And so part of this thing or part of this process is the willingness to notice discrepancies and the ability to do so. And so sometimes the need for evaluation arises in the discrepancy between what currently is and what we think should be or ought to be or ought not to be. And sometimes there's a split between what we expected and what we got, maybe a split between what we wanted and what we didn't want, or what we planned and what actually occurred. And so as we go through this reflective process, as we engage in evaluative thinking, this opens the door for us to start to be able to document, to think about some of those different types of questions, and then again, perhaps maybe shift what we're doing in order to improve, in order to change, in order to meet different goals, or even to question, are the goals that we have the appropriate goals for what we're doing right now? And sometimes we're working towards goals in terms of the ought or ought not to be, where we haven't really considered, right? Is this actually what we want to be doing, right? And so maybe it's not necessarily that what we're doing is not valid or good. Maybe the goals we're working towards are simply need to be shifted or aren't correct at this time. So as we're going through this, what ends up happening is we go through these cycles of learning. And this is never, and it should never be a static process. And we should continually be going through this process of, one, observation. So observe the environment, reflect, have a discussion or dialogue, implement something, and then we continue the process over and over and over again. And so with a developmental evaluation approach or action research approach, I mean, we see this is a critical element of those types of approaches. But as I mentioned before, this can also just be part of our regular evaluative thinking environment or culture that we establish within our environments. As we, again, reflect on, observe, have conversations, implement changes, and just mindfully go through this process over and over and over again. Hopefully, again, this will lead to more effective practice and more effective decision making. In terms of evaluations then, in terms of the types of questions that we ask or can ask with respect to our own practice, with respect to the decisions that are being made within our environment, there's no right or wrong answer as to what these questions should be. And I think what I've tried to provide here are just some example questions on kind of a continuum from sort of small in scope to larger scope. And the idea would be that, depending upon what it is you're working on in your own circumstances, you can kind of decide anywhere in here kind of where you fall. So with the smaller scope, for example, I mean, after we engage in activity, it could be something simply as, having a discussion with someone else, like, how did that activity go? Why did it work? Why didn't it work? The larger scope would obviously be more of our conventional program evaluation, where we can ask things like, what are the program strengths and weaknesses? Did it go as I expected or intended, or why? Is there anything I could do differently next time so it would be better? And on and on and on. I think when we think about these types of things, and this kind of just goes back to this notion of evaluative thinking, that part of this, once again, just comes back to this larger cultural issue in terms of our willingness to engage in evaluative thinking at all. I like to use the example or think about the example of a young child learning to walk. And if you ever watched a young child learning to walk, what you realize is they're pretty bad at it at first. They actually really suck at it. they can't walk very well. They fall all the time. And so from an evaluative perspective, if I was doing kind of more of a summative evaluation, I would say, like, you get an F on this, you're not very good at it. But the interesting thing about watching a young child learn to walk is they don't get all depressed and upset when they fall down. If you watch them, what they do is whenever they fall down, they just get back up and keep walking. And what we see is that the failure or supposed failure there is simply a part of their learning process. Somewhere between there and when we go into school, we kind of lose that mentality, and we instead take on this mindset that failure is not acceptable, but that failure is something to be avoided at all costs. But sometimes it's in those failures that we learn the most information. And so with respect to the culture, providing an opportunity or a culture where we actually have a focus on the learning that takes place, we're more likely, I think, to get people willing to engage in this kind of evaluative thinking, to actually ask those questions about how can I improve? What are the things I need to better? What didn't work well? And on and on and on. Now, the other thing as well with this is that sometimes if something doesn't necessarily go well, it might simply be that the way that we're asking the questions maybe has problems. So, for example, maybe the goals we had weren't realistic to begin with. And again, this is an important part of discovery. If, for example, we realize that we expected an elephant to climb a tree, or we think, literacy was the most important outcome, when really what we should have been asking about was the relationships that developed. Maybe it wasn't that we were doing the wrong thing. Maybe we were just measuring it in the wrong way, or in a way that didn't allow for the true value of what we're doing to actually be manifest. So here's some tools that just put together to give you some ideas about different ways that perhaps we can support evaluative thinking within different organizations and cultures. So what I've got here is just again, a chart or a table that kind of describes both formal and informal ways in which we can capture data. So the formal would be, again, your kind of conventional evaluation, where you might have something like a document analysis, or engage in a formal focus group, or individual interviews, surveys, participant observations, which again are all very valid, but may not be necessary on a moment-to-moment or case-by-case basis. So the informal types of correlates to those formal processes might be something as simple as reviewing case notes, annual reports, strategic plans, theories of change, documents that we've created within our organization, and asking some of those key questions about, what are actually our goals? What do we consider as evidence? How do we define success? In contrast to focus groups, maybe reflective team meetings might be an opportunity where we can have some of those conversations. Participant groups, things like that, where people are meeting naturally, where we can just take a few moments to engage in some reflective questions, which I've got some on the next slide, which we'll talk about in a moment. Staff meetings, home visits in terms of individual interviews, in place of surveys and assessments, maybe snapshot surveys, polling, as we've experienced here at the beginning of this webinar, and perhaps even things like daily personal reflections, participant data. All of those are things that we can kind of do on an informal basis, but what they do, again, is they allow us to really thoughtfully consider the data that we are basing our decisions on, or whether or not we're actually using data at all to make those decisions, or are we using perhaps some other approach, the common sense, the gut instinct kind of approach to decision making. So with respect to some of those things that we could use, so if we are in a meeting, for example, this could be something that we could actually have. So a critical thinking guide, as we're going through either our documents or we're in a planning meeting, we could simply having something simple like this, where we set up maybe a document, or this forms the basis of a discussion where we ask questions like who and what. And so the questions are, for example, who benefits from this? Who is this harmful to? Who makes decisions about this? who is most directly affected, who is missing, and the what. What are the strengths and weaknesses? What's another perspective? What's another alternative? And what would be a counter argument? Just to kind of guide our discussion in terms of some of those programs or initiatives or things that we're doing. Um, the other thing that I will say in terms of this, in terms of making decisions about how we kind of go about these types of data reflection opportunities, is thinking again very explicitly about where we are in the process. Because the types of information, the types of decisions that we make will really honestly depend upon where we happen to be in that process. If we're just beginning an initiative in year one or in month one or whatever, it's probably premature to really be asking questions about long-term impacts of that program when we're simply just starting it. So in terms of those types of things, we could ask about, the relationships. How are our relationships sort of forming? Do we have like a terms of reference and so forth and so on? If we're looking at the end of a multi-year kind of program or initiative or partnership, we might start to ask some questions about, what's the benefit that we've sort of introduced? What's the impact that we've had? So knowing where we are in the cycle can impact, I think, the types of information that we collect and maximize the benefit of that particular information. Another tool that I found to be especially useful for myself, this is one of the things that I had a supervisor way back when I was at graduate school that told me, keep a journal on you all the time. And when you have ideas, when things come up, pull out your journal and write it down, because sometimes those thoughts are kind of fleeting, and if you don't capture them in the moment, they may be gone forever. And so for a personal reflection journal, if you make a habit of having something like this around, again, it doesn't have to be written, but after you engage in some process, you can ask yourself, like, how did it go? After I engage in team meetings for different evaluations, sometimes what I'll do is come back to my office and just jot down my thoughts about, how it went, what happened or what didn't happen, what I think some of the challenges might be, when I'm going to, if I do this next time, what am I going to change? Just to kind of keep track of my headspace in the moment when these types of things happen. Because again, I find as you move farther out from the event, sometimes those thoughts change, and you lose some of the essential elements of those things. So for me, this is one of the critical ones, and having that personal reflection journal kind of always with you as a standard practice, really I find quite helpful. Monthly team meetings could be another kind of area where we could gather information. And one of the things that you could have are just as standing items on an agenda, and this doesn't have to take long, but some reflective questions. Things like, what's changed since the last meeting? What currently works well and why? What do we want to do more of or less of? What's one thing that has challenged you in the last month? And on and on and on. And again, we could have lots of different questions here, just depending upon the culture of the organization or the team. But again, the more that we have that evaluative thinking culture and the willingness to engage in evaluative thinking, I think that you're going to find you get better information that comes out of these types of reflective questions, where it's okay to actually talk about things that maybe didn't go as well as we'd hoped, and talk about maybe why they didn't go as well. One of my, again, going back to my experience as a teacher, one of my most memorable teaching moments was actually a horrendous flop. I was teaching introductory psychology and had this great idea that I was going to do a little activity with the students to show how, if you organize information semantically, you can remember more information. So I created two types of word sheets. One was just random words altogether, and the other sheet was the same words but organized semantically. and they didn't know there was 2 groups. I handed them out, and my plan was the people who got the list that were organized semantically should recall more information, and so I had them try to memorize this information. We did a memory test, and then I did my big reveal, and lo and behold, there was absolutely no difference between any of these groups. So I'm standing up in front of the class, completely red-faced, embarrassed. But what made it a great learning experience was I said, well, you know what? Okay, well, here's what I thought should happen, and this is what I had planned. And one of the students put her hand up and said, you know what? When you said it was a memory test, even though I had this random list of words, the very first thing I did was organize it semantically. And then many of the other students said the same thing. And it actually turned into this great learning opportunity for me and for the students to have this great conversation about, memory and different types of things. But that's only possible if you're willing to admit that it's okay for things to go wrong and to be willing to figure out how you can improve and what can go better. And so again, those monthly team meetings, I think, can be a critical moment where we can gather that type of information. Annual reflection meetings could also be something where maybe this is something more formal, where annually or however often makes sense to you, you actually engage in a reflective meeting where you bring together people to talk about, where have we been, where are we now, where do we want to go, and on purpose or purposefully make some of those kinds of decisions. Other things that potentially could be useful, snapshot surveys. So here's one that you could use something similar to this, where this would be nice and easy. So you just hand this out in a meeting context or prior to meetings with someone, and then you just got, what you do is you ask people to just fill in the blanks. So one thing that you learned today, one thing that's unclear, one thing that you felt redundant, and one thing that will be useful to you. And you can use this as information, or I think, and sometimes even more importantly, as a conversation starter. We can actually have a conversation about the information that's being collected there. Polls are another way that you can gather information. Again, these can be face-to-face types of things, or these can be electronic polls like we saw today. And all of these, I think, can provide opportunities both for data collection, but also for conversations about that data and what that data means and what we can do with that data in the future and so forth and so on. Now, the cool thing about this is, or one of the things that I find really cool about kind of evaluative thinking, is trying to understand, when that it's actually happening. So we sit here today and talk all about evaluative thinking and about the evaluative thinking process. But one of the things we might want to know is, so we're engaged in this process, but are we having an impact? Are we having an effect? And so some of the things that I found that have helped me to see, is evaluative thinking actually taking place, or when you start to hear comments like, why are we assuming X, or how do we know X, or the one that I really love is, what evidence do we have for whatever it is we're looking at, and so forth and so on. And when you start to hear these types of comments, I think that's a really big clue that you're starting to see evaluative thinking take hold. Again, so one of the things that you can try to do then is promote in yourself, first of all, those types of questions, and to be constantly asking yourself those questions about, how do I know what I know? What evidence do I have to make this particular connection? What's the thinking behind the way that we or that I do something like that, or how can I do better in different types of situations? Gene King talks about free range evaluation, and free range evaluation is evaluative thinking that lives unfettered in an organization and is made stronger by freely moving among people, programs, and special projects, and taking sustenance from its natural surroundings. Its vulnerability is also a strength. If it survives the challenges it confronts, it becomes stronger. And I think this, to me, really speaks to kind of the crux of what it is that I think is important about evaluative thinking. And really it is creating that context, that culture where it's not only okay to ask those types of questions, it's encouraged. And that if we foster this in ourselves and others around us, that the decisions that we end up making, I firmly believe, will be better decisions, They'll be based on evidence and to the best that we can, and that we can institute these cycles of improvement where we're constantly considering the data that we have, the data that we need to get, the decisions that we've made, the benefits that we're having, uh, both again from a positive and sometimes from a negative perspective in terms of improvement. And that's everything I have for you today. I'm happy to take questions, but again, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and hopefully you found something useful from the discussion we've had today.
Thank you very much, Jason. So if you do have questions, you can ask them by clicking on the GoToWebinar control panel, and you can type in your question below. You can see in the chat box, Corey typed in a message that should pop up on your screen. The first question we have is from Stephanie. The question is, what is the difference between evaluative thinking and critical thinking? How would you separate those, Jason?
Yeah, and I wouldn't, that's a great question. I don't necessarily think that they're separate things. I think critical thinking is a subcomponent of evaluative thinking. Evaluative thinking, I think, is critical thinking within an evaluation context.
We had another question about templates. Do you know of, or are there good places to find templates for evaluations? Just some resources to get started. And again, I'll send it in the show notes. I'll post a link to the AMP evaluation toolkit for the mentoring program. But Jason, where would you recommend somebody get started?
I think some of those are good, like the one you mentioned, like that's a very good one. There are some other ones off the top of my head. I can't give you I don't have the URLs off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to provide a list if that would be useful for people of different types of resources and places that people can go if that would be useful.
Yeah, a second question along that frame too. What are your favorite tools for evaluating evaluative thinking?
Yeah. Honestly, I think I find those team meetings and the kind of reflective opportunities we take there are usually the best situations. In most cases, honestly, when it's modeled by team leaders, and then when you start to see it actually, as I mentioned, in kind of the comments of people saying, so more of the informal kind of process I find with evaluative thinking, rather than sending out questionnaires saying, do you engage in evaluative thinking and evaluative thought processes? As you see it work its way through groups and through organizations, you really start to see it come out in the types of comments and the types of questions. And you sit down in a team meeting, and then you'll hear stuff like, okay, so how do we do, and not only how do we do, but how do we know, or what's the evidence, or how do we define success, or kind of the key things that I'll be looking for in those situations.
Christine asked, has the webinar been recorded? Will it be available? Yes, it has. And we post all of our webinars to our YouTube channel, which you can visit. Just search Alberta Mentoring Partnership on YouTube and you can subscribe. So you'll see the video there as well. We're going to post a podcast episode, which will also have the PowerPoint attached as well too. I feel bad for the people just listening to the audio because Jason had some fantastic images and cartoons and really good stuff there. So we'll look for a couple other questions, and then we will conclude the presentation as well. Jason, there's been a bunch of different comments coming through about they really appreciated the presentation and great feedback there too. I'm just trying to read that one. A question about being intersectional and working with ESL students or those with other language barriers. How does your thinking around evaluation shift, in particular if you're doing oral or verbal evaluations?
Yeah, and I mean, that's going to be a case-by-case basis, and obviously you want to make sure your evaluation tools, whether they're written or oral, are accessible to everybody that you're working with. Some alternatives that I've seen, both in terms of literacy levels, but also in terms of language barriers, could be things like arts-based types of evaluation process. Some of the things that I've seen work really well, asking people to draw, their experiences, then having a conversation insofar as we can to talk about those things. Again, sometimes we rely, honestly, We rely on translators sometimes to help us to make sure that the types of things that or things that we're gathering are understood, and that we're gathering information that is accurate. But I think there are a number of options that we can use. Again, the arts base being one example, but things like that where we can get away from sort of oral or written and try to focus on stuff that hopefully everybody can kind of engage in.
We have another question. Often we see people confusing outputs and outcomes. Are there good resources to understand objectives, outputs, and outcomes?
Yeah, I think and again, I don't have the URLs on top of my head right now, but there are a number of things where I've seen great kind of, especially when you get into the realm of like logic models, where you find great description of logic models that really go through and define each step of that process, and sort of what an output, what an outcome is, and what the different elements of those are. Without the URLs, if I was sort of trying to do a Google search on that, what I would Google search are just logic models and setting up logic models. And what you usually find with those are really nice kind of descriptions of the different pieces there.
We'll also recommend again the Everyday Evaluation on the Run, the user-friendly introductory
Mm,
guide to effective evaluation, the third edition that Jason cited, as well as the other resource he shared, which you can see on your screen now. It's funny because we just finished our A&P Research Day on May 25th, and we had a session on evaluation, which we'll also be posting online, which had some really good tips, tricks, handouts, etc. So that'll be coming up soon on the Alberta Mentoring Partnership website. And this is the second time I've heard this book recommended. So Jason, thanks again for reiterating that. We'll point the audience there. We have a couple other questions, and I'm just struggling to read here. Any tips for embedding reflective practice in program delivery? I think they're talking about for the frontline folks.
Yeah, and again, I think team meetings are a great opportunity for those types of things. And again, whether it's a formal, informal kind of team meeting, if you can kind of make it a habit to start or end those meetings with some of those reflective questions. And it doesn't have to be the entire list that we've got there. I think even as simple as, um, you know, uh, let's think about this past week, this past day. What went well, what didn't go well, and what can we improve on. And honestly, where I've seen it, it just becomes, or the more it becomes kind of a habit to do that, I think that's where you start to see it really kind of take hold, where it just becomes really just a standing item where we sit down. The very first thing we do is, okay, let's think about our past week and, maybe one success, one thing we'd like to improve on, and then go from there.
Another question, do you have experience linking the evaluation of effectiveness and the evaluation of inclusivity / accessibility for programs?
I personally haven't done a lot on the accessibility inclusivity, so I wouldn't really feel comfortable in commenting on that. Effectiveness, I've done a lot of stuff, but not sort of the combination of the two.
And I guess we'll open that up to the attendees then. If you're aware of a response that would be helpful, please do send it in, and we can attach it to the show notes as well too. Another comment, I appreciated the fact that you saw value in informal evaluation, as when you made the introduction, you showed that ET is the process we do all the time. So some love for informal
Excellent.
evaluation as well.
Awesome.
And yeah, I know there was when I was looking through the list of who responded, I saw some folks from funders and that side of the equation as well too. What advice, Jason, would you have for them as they're dealing with emerging evaluation capacity in the nonprofit sector?
I think that, and with respect to funders, and I think it's really important that with all of these, like we talk a lot about, and often I think it's not the most effective way to talk about it. It's almost like in some cases it sounds like an adversarial relationship, right? So you got the funders versus I think the most effective kind of approach is really to to get together with everybody at the beginning of evaluation and have some of those conversations about um, the different needs that all the organizations have. Because obviously funders have accountability needs, right? They need to account for the funds that they allocate for different types of things, and we don't discount the importance of that. But at the same time, the funding questions themselves also need to be balanced with the needs of the actual, the agencies or the clients. And so I think the most effective evaluations are ones where it's more of a team approach, where everybody's kind of working towards the same goal, and the goal is to improve service or to improve outcomes for individuals. And as I said, I think sometimes it's this false dichotomy where it's one or the other, where it doesn't always have to be one or the other. Um, but again, it's important to have those conversations, because I think um, if we just assume that what we're doing is going to meet everybody's needs, I think that that's not always the case. And so having that conversation and being really explicit and clear about what the expectations and what the needs are can allow, I think, everybody to win from an evaluation. And it doesn't have to be an onerous, or the other case where I've seen it not onerous or horrible, but simply becomes a checkbox that somebody does just to get it done with and to meet a requirement, which I think is a waste of resources in many cases if we're doing that.
Yeah, no, very, very well said. Well, we're gonna have to conclude questions there. We want to make sure that Jason has a chance to get back to work and to get going. For those of you who do have your browser windows open, I highly advise, if you go to albertamentors.ca, at the top of the page, you'll see little icons to get to our Facebook page, our Twitter. You can find our Google presence, as well as our YouTube channel, our Instagram, and our SoundCloud, where you can get all of the audio. As well on your phones, if you tap on the podcast app, the Stitcher app, the Google Play app, please do subscribe and look up the various other resources that we're having. We are sharing on our YouTube channel. You'll see that we post our webinars, and there's a couple others for those of you who are interested in fund development. There's an excellent webinar there, number 11, with Denisha from Big Brothers Big Sisters of Edmonton. We also have this excellent presentation from using mentorship to frame brain development, and how mentoring is more than just a friendship, how it's important to think about how we're building brains and building communities. And so when you're talking to funders and you're thinking big about your valuation and what you're doing, this will give you some different perspectives, how to think about outcomes and outputs and all of those different matters that you touched on today. So I highly recommend that. It's from the Frameworks Institute in the United States. We've been working with them, as well as the National Mentoring Partnership in the United States. So finally, thank you again, Jason. This was excellent, and thank you for stepping in at the on short notice to help us out. We'll be posting this in the next few days, and we encourage you to share it widely to all other folks in your organization. And Jason, if folks have questions after the webinar's ended, we'll share your PowerPoint, but is there a good way to reach you?
Email is probably the best, and my email is on the PowerPoint, so I'm happy to answer any email questions people have.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And there it is right there. Perfect. Yeah. Have a wonderful afternoon, and enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks.